She hid her earth-sheltered chamber inside the barn until a blizzard proved it kept her warm. The wind that morning did not sound normal. It did not whistle or sigh like it usually did across the Siberian taiga. It roared like something alive, something angry, something hunting. And when Anna Petrovna stepped out her barn and looked at the sky turning a strange green-gray color, she knew this was a storm people would talk about for years. The temperature was already 12 degrees below zero, and it was only November. Anna was 34 years old, a widow living alone on 60 acres of hard Siberian land 40 miles northwest of Omsk. 2 years earlier, typhoid had taken her husband Ivan and left her with a half-broken farm, a small debt, and neighbors who quietly wondered how long she would last on her own. Well, she lasted, not because she was lucky, not because the winters were kind, but because she studied the land like it was a living teacher. That morning, as she stacked firewood against the eastern wall of her barn, Mikhail Ivanov rode up on his gray mare. His face looked tight under his fur cap. "The barometer dropped fast," he called out. "Faster than I've seen in 23 years out here. Bring your stock in. This one's going to be bad." Anna nodded. She had already done it. The cows were inside. The horses were secured. Feed bins were full. Water troughs were covered. But what Mikhail did not know was that the barn held more than livestock. From the outside, the barn looked ordinary. Pine logs, birch shingles, walls sealed with clay and moss. Nothing about it stood out. Inside and hidden behind stacked hay bales and hanging harnesses was something no one in the county fully understood. 14 months earlier, Anna had started digging. While her neighbors repaired fences or hauled timber, she carried bucket after bucket of earth out of her barn at night. She scattered the soil across her land so no one would see a pile and ask questions. She cut thick sod bricks. She hauled flat stones from a frozen creek 3 miles away. She salvaged lumber from an abandoned claim. She was building a room inside the barn, a chamber buried into the northern wall. Earth packed thick around 3 sides. 3 feet of sod insulation sealing the exposed wall. Stone floor beneath her boots. A small iron stove with a careful vent that connected to the barn chimney. Yet she had studied how families in the old villages built earth shelters back in her homeland. She had read old agricultural journals in Omsk. She learned that deep underground the earth stayed near 54 degrees all year. The taiga might freeze above. The wind might scream across the land, but below the frost line the ground stayed steady. She believed she could use that. When she finished, the chamber measured 12 foot x 14 feet, 7 feet high. Shelves lined one wall stacked with salt pork, dried apples, rye flour, beans, smoked venison, and 60 pounds of tea. Blankets were folded tight. Lamp oil was sealed in tins. Medical supplies sat ready. Enough provision for months. It cost her nearly 40 rubles, money she barely had. And the neighbors noticed. Dmitry Volkov came first. He had survived the great blizzards of the 1870s and believed strongly in simple methods. He stood inside her barn, arms crossed, studying the hidden chamber. "Too complicated," he said. "Out here, simple keeps you alive." Elena Kuznetsova came next. She had seen underground rooms in the old country. She worried about damp air and sadness from being buried away from light. Sergei Petrov, younger but raised on the step, said quietly, "If this fails in a storm, there's no second chance." Their words stayed with her. Sometimes at night, she wondered if they were right. Maybe she had built something clever instead of something wise. Maybe she had trusted numbers too much. But she kept testing it, lighting the stove, watching the air vents, checking the structure after heavy rain, feeling the stone floor hold warmth long after fire died down. Now, on that November afternoon in 1882, the storm finally arrived. By 2 o'clock, the wind slammed into the barn like a moving wall. The temperature dropped 31 degrees in 6 hours. The air outside cut the lungs like glass. Anna lit the small stove inside the hidden chamber. The room slowly warmed to 68 degrees. The stone floor absorbed the heat. The thick sod walls held it in. In the main barn, even with the cows and horses breathing heavily, the temperature struggled to stay above 15 degrees. Then she heard it, a pounding against the barn door. Not wind, hands. She forced the door open against the storm. Snow burst inside, like a white explosion. Elena Kuznetsova stumbled in first. Behind her was her daughter, Olga, 6 months pregnant, face pale and shaking. A young boy clung to her coat. A roof collapsed. Elena shouted over the wind. Snow too heavy. Dmitri is coming, too. His chimney fell. Smoke filled the house. The wind screamed louder. The sky darkened though it was still afternoon. Within minutes, more figures appeared through the white storm. Dmitri Volkov, his wife, 3 children, and his elderly mother burning with fever. Mikhail and his sons. Sergei dragging a family who'd been caught on the open road. 17 people crowded into the barn. The temperature outside had dropped to 23 below zero. The wind tore at the walls. Inside the main barn, frost began forming on the beams. Anna looked at Olga, shaking violently. She looked at Dmitri's elderly mother, gasping for air. Then she walked to the northern wall. "Come with me," she said. She pulled aside the hay bales. A heavy plank door appeared like a secret in plain sight. When she opened it, warm air flowed out like a breath of spring. One by one, the neighbors stepped inside the hidden chamber. Their faces changed. Shock, relief, silence. The room glowed softly in lamplight. The stove burned steady. The air felt warm against frozen skin. The stone floor held heat like it had been waiting for this moment. Elena stared at the earth walls. "You built this alone?" she asked quietly. Anna nodded. Behind them, the wind struck the barn again, harder than before, and outside, the real blizzard had only just begun. The wind did not stop when night came. It grew stronger. Inside the barn, the beams groaned under pressure. Snow forced its way through cracks in the wood. The animals shifted nervously, their breath rising in thick clouds that froze against the walls. But inside the hidden chamber, the air stayed steady and warm. Anna moved quickly. She placed the elderly grandmother near the warmest wall. She wrapped blankets around Olga and guided her to sit on a folded stack of quilts. The children were placed along the stone floor, their backs resting against walls that held heat like a living thing. 17 people in a room built for 6. Still it worked. The stove burned strong, but controlled. Anna adjusted the draft carefully, watching the vent pipe to make sure smoke flowed cleanly upward into the barn chimney. She had calculated the air flow months ago, testing it in different weather. Now it proved itself. Dmitri Volkov sat quietly for a long time, his back against the warm wall. The proud man who once questioned her design now looked around with open disbelief. "I never felt warmth like this during a blizzard," he said softly, "not without burning half a forest." Anna gave him a small nod, but said nothing. She was counting wood in her mind, measuring time, listening to the rhythm of the storm above them. By midnight, the temperature outside had fallen to 37 below zero. The wind screamed at more than 60 miles per hour. Snow piled high against the barn doors, sealing them shut from the outside. The main barn had become nearly as cold as the open taiga. Even the cows were struggling, their breath thin and sharp. If these families had stayed in their homes, none of them would have lasted the night. Inside the chamber, the temperature stayed at 71 degrees. The stone floor radiated warmth upward. The thick sod insulation blocked the brutal cold. The earth behind the walls released stored heat slowly, just as Anna had predicted. The chamber did not fight the land. It worked with it. Elena watched the walls carefully. "In the old villages," she said quietly, "we built with earth, but I never thought to build like this here." Anna finally spoke. "The land does not change because we move to it. We have to learn its ways." Olga leaned back against the wall, her breathing steadier now. Her unborn child rested safe in warmth that did not exist anywhere else for miles. The second day was worse. The wind peaked sometime after midnight. It struck the barn with such force that the entire structure shuddered. Snow buried the lower half of the outer walls. The entrance was completely blocked. In the main barn, 3 cattle froze to death despite standing shoulder to shoulder. Sergei checked the outer space carefully through a small crack in the chamber door. Ice coated the beams. Frost hung like white fur from the rafters. "Without this room," he said quietly, "we would be gone." Anna continued feeding the stove small amounts of split pine. 8 pounds of wood in 24 hours. That was all it needed. The thermal mass did the rest. She rotated people closer to the warmest wall in shifts. She checked for frostbite. She boiled water for broth. She handed out tea in small cups that warmed both hands and spirits. Dmitri's grandmother, who had arrived burning with fever, began to improve. The steady warmth kept her breathing calm. Children who had arrived crying now slept quietly. On the second night, the storm roared again. The wind reached nearly 78 miles per hour. The temperature outside dropped to 42 below zero. It was the kind of cold that killed within minutes. Inside, the chamber stayed between 67 and 74 degrees. The air remained fresh. The ventilation vents near the ceiling allowed stale air to rise and escape, while pulling in just enough clean air without letting the cold overwhelm them. Dmitri studied the vents closely. "You've thought of everything," he said, but Anna shook her head slightly. "I thought of failure. Then I built against it." By the third morning, the wind finally began to fade. The roar softened to a low moan. The stove still burned steady. The people inside the chamber were tired but alive. 17 people who would not have survived in ordinary izbas, or even in the barn alone. When the silence finally came, it felt strange. Sergei and Mikhail forced open the chamber door. Together, they dug through packed snow that had drifted nearly 15 feet high against the barn entrance. It took hours to break through. When the door finally opened to the outside world, sunlight poured across a frozen white landscape that looked nothing like the farm they knew. The taiga had been buried. Chicken coops were gone under drifts, wagons half hidden, fence lines erased. Yet every single person inside the chamber stepped out into that light alive. Dmitri stood in the snow, looking back at the barn. "I doubted you," he said plainly. "I told you it was too complex. I was wrong." Elena took Anna's hands in hers. "You did not build clever," she said. "You built wise." Olga smiled through tears, one hand resting on her belly. "My child lives because of you." Anna looked at the buried land around them. She did not smile widely. She did not celebrate loudly. She simply nodded. She had built something she hoped she would never need, and it had just saved 17 lives. When the storm finally passed, the land looked like a graveyard of white waves frozen in place. Drifts stood taller than fences. The road to Omsk had disappeared. Yet smoke rose from only a few chimneys across the distant land, thin and weak against the bright blue sky. But Anna's barn still stood, and inside it, 17 people had survived what many were already calling the worst blizzard in years. The digging took most of the day. Sergei and Mikhail worked with shovels until their hands were raw. Dmitri joined them once his grandmother was stable enough to sit upright. Snow had packed hard against the barn doors like cement. It took axes to break through the outer crust. When the door finally opened wide, sunlight flooded into the barn. The cold air rushed in, sharp and bitter, but it no longer carried the deadly force of the storm. One by one, the family stepped outside. They looked at what remained of their homes. Elena's izba had lost half its roof. Snow filled the kitchen and bedroom, but Dmitri's chimney had collapsed completely, leaving black soot streaked down the side of his cabin. The family's wagon had overturned somewhere along the road and now lay half buried in a drift. The land had shown no mercy. Dmitri stood in the snow for a long moment, then turned toward Anna. "I've lived here 9 years," he said. "I thought I understood this land, but I never thought to use it the way you did." Anna brushed snow from her coat sleeve. "I only listened," she said. "The earth stays steady. It's the wind that lies." Word spread fast. Within days, riders came to see the hidden chamber inside the barn. Men who once shook their heads now stepped quietly into the warm room and touched the sod walls with careful hands. The women traced the stone floor with their boots and looked at the ventilation vents near the ceiling. "How deep did you dig?" they asked. "How thick is the insulation? How much does it burn?" Anna answered every question simply. She showed them her sketches. She explained the idea of thermal mass in plain words. She spoke about how the earth below the frost line holds steady warmth. She told them how she tested the airflow again and again before trusting it. She did not brag. She did not remind them of their doubts. By spring, 11 families had begun building their own earthbank shelters. Some attached them to barns. Others built them near their homes. They used limestone instead of sod when they had it. Some made the rooms larger to hold more people. But they all followed the same idea: work with the land, not against it. The Provincial Agricultural Office eventually sent an inspector from Omsk. He arrived with measuring tools and a notebook, expecting to find a lucky accident. Instead, he found careful planning. He measured the wall thickness, tested airflow, calculated heat retention. After 3 days, he admitted what the others already knew. Her design worked. The newspaper in Omsk printed her story that summer. They called her Shelter and Innovation. They praised her strength as a widow alone on the frontier. Anna did not enjoy the attention. She told a reporter, "I did not invent anything. People have built with earth for centuries. I only learned from them." Years passed. The chamber remained in the barn, ready every winter. It was used again during smaller storms. Neighbors sometimes sheltered there overnight when the wind grew fierce. Olga gave birth to a healthy son that spring. She named him Andre after Anna as a quiet thank you. The boy grew strong. The barn stood for decades, even during the brutal winters of the 1890s, and later during the harsh seasons that followed. The chamber protected families when the cold turned cruel again. Anna never remarried. She kept her farm until 1900, then moved into Omsk to live with her niece as her hair turned silver and her hands stiffened from years of work. When she died in 1918 at the age of 70, people did not remember her as the woman who built a clever room. They remembered her as the woman who thought ahead. The barn was finally torn down in 1957. The land changed hands. Modern equipment replaced horse teams. Roads were paved. Electricity reached the farms. But before the demolition, engineers came to measure the chamber. They studied its design. They drew careful diagrams of the sod walls and the stone floor. They calculated how the thermal mass stored heat and how the ventilation kept air clean without losing warmth. They discovered what Anna already knew in 1882. 3 feet of packed sod insulates better than most modern walls. The earth below the frost line stays steady. A small stove can heat a room if the room is built to hold that heat. But the Siberian land still stretches wide. The wind still howls in winter. Temperatures still fall low enough to kill in minutes. But somewhere in old archives, in faded photographs and engineering drawings, the memory of that hidden chamber remains. 17 people survived because one widow refused to accept that old methods were the only way. She listened to experience. She respected tradition, but she also trusted her own thinking. When the blizzard came, her quiet work spoke louder than any doubt. The earth had always been there beneath their feet. Anna was simply the first among them to build with it. And because she did, 17 lives walked back into the sunlight after a storm that was meant to bury them forever.